Rachel and I are talking about the surprising potency of behavioral treatment of phobias. Oh, we do have a handout. I'm going to pass this out. I'll stay up on the mat so the camera stays on me. Forgot about the handout. Phobia is an irrational belief of something, some stimulus. It usually involves avoidance, and it can involve great emotion and great efforts to avoid. I've had two phobias myself. One was a phobia of public speaking. Good thing I got over that, or I wouldn't be here today. The other, I did get over that through being forced to take public speaking classes in high school and university. The other one was, I think, more severe, is a phobia of diving into water. And that's a dangerous one, because if you go into water and you're very afraid, you panic and you die. That one I had to actually treat myself for, and I'll tell you how I did that, sort of. It's the way I treat all my clients, too. I always wanted to treat people with phobias when I was in my clinical program. Never had a chance. I thought this straightforward treatment, high success rate, I can do this and succeed. I never got a chance after I got my PhD. I created opportunities, and I have been treating people here and there for phobias ever since. There are different methods of using exposure treatment for phobias. One is, I'll tell you some of the rare ones, flooding, where you put them in the scariest possible situation. So if it's someone afraid of snakes, remember the Indiana Jones movie where he fell into the room of snakes? Now, you wouldn't have deadly snakes with the person. That would be crazy to do that. But you would have a lot, perhaps a number of non-dangerous snakes in one person. And through the exposure, if the person will do it and stay in there, the person is likely to get over that phobia. That's flooding. There's also implosive therapy, which is more gentle on a person. That's imagining being in that most scary situation. If it's with snakes, again, having snakes on you or around you. I don't use either one of those. Those, I think, are too scary, too stressful for a person. I don't know how many clients would agree to those. They are afraid. If you've ever had a phobia, you know what fear is and what terror is. And I've felt that fear. So it'd be hard to get people to do that. So I tend to use in vivo. That's the third type. In vivo, gradual exposure. In vivo means in life. And so we gradually expose them to elements of the feared stimulus. If we're talking about snakes now, I might start with the drawing of a snake. Might go to a photograph, video of a snake moving, seeing a toy snake, seeing a toy snake holding a toy snake, seeing a live snake behind glass that's that thick, and then getting closer to a real snake, holding a real snake, holding a big. This is what we call the fear hierarchy. And so we establish that before we do any of the exposure trials, and then we do exposure little by little, usually 7-minute trials. So whatever the situation is, looking at a drawing, spend 7 or 8 minutes doing it. That's part of gradual exposure. There's also exposure and imagery, where we do the same thing, the gradual exposure and imagery. We go through the fear hierarchy step by step, doing exposure after exposure at one level until the client's ready to go up. And then we go up, and we try to go up that much so it doesn't seem so frightening. And then we go up that much again, and that much, and that much. And then we get all the way up there to whatever we want, being able to go to a zoo and see snakes, see them on TV, and so on. Virtual reality is new and fun and exciting for us. And Rachel will be talking about virtual reality treatment for social anxiety. That's the sort of a hybrid. It's similar to exposure and imagery, and but it makes it more realistic and requires less of the person for imagining. So the steps of doing the treatment of gradual exposure treatment usually involves the fear hierarchy, and then gradually exposing the person and going up. There are some other very important elements to it, the way I do it, which may help explain why it's so potent, and that's really what we're talking about. Before the client is exposed to the stimulus, I always do it. So I model the behavior in advance. And sometimes that's very important, like with snakes and spiders and so on. So I'm going to be, when you get to the live snake, I'm going to hold the live snake first. And I'm going to have a spider. Usually I wouldn't touch a spider myself, but I have it in a clear container. So I'm going to do everything first, and if it's high on a building or near a bridge, I will go do that first. So I'm using modeling. The exposure itself you can think of as respondent extinction, if you know that term, where if you know the terms unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus, what we're going to do is expose the person to the conditioned stimulus over and over with nothing actually dangerous, and that person through that repeated exposure is going to learn or relearn there's nothing dangerous here. We can tell the person's nothing dangerous, but it's hard to convince a person with facts. There's an unconscious part of the brain that has to be convinced, usually has to be convinced with actual experience. And then we use one other very important element that makes this all powerful, and that's reinforcement, operant conditioning, or praise. And the usual praise we'll use is, that was very brave of you, because I understand fear, we understand fear, and when you face your fear, how can you be braver than that? And for people who think of themselves as afraid, when they hear themselves being legitimately praised for doing something brave, that can be potent. If you want to have praise for power, there's a chance for potency. So let me show you. I'll get out of this and we'll close this now. That's my only slide. Let me show you a little video. This is a video of me. Rachel helped me with this, by the way. It was treatment of a woman who had a long-term, 30 years or so, phobia of snakes. She wanted to get over that, not transmit it, model it for children, and be free of that. And so she agreed to go on a show called This Time Next Year. And this episode was broadcast a couple of weeks ago, although we did the treatment many months before that. And you can see an example of some of the exposure trials and then what it led to.
Today we're at the Australian Reptile Park. I'm really nervous knowing that there are snakes around.
We're going to do a treatment that's the same thing I used on myself years ago. We're going to treat Simone through gradual exposure using snake stimuli starting at a low level of fear for her, which would be looking at a color photograph of snakes.
Oh. Oh. Oh, my heart.
All the way up through toy snakes.
Oh! Okay.
It's a toy.
Might just take me a moment to move, I think.
That's all right. Take your time. And then actually being close to real snakes.
That snake is really freaking me out. Oh.
Now, at some point, you're going to hold the snake.
What was I thinking? I can't do it. Oh! Oh, sorry, can you just take it? Sorry. Oh. Oh.
Welcome back to This Time Next Year. We all saw how much snakes terrified Simone. Is that the sort of fear a person can even conquer in a year? It's time to find out.
That's that. So there are some surprising things that develop in phobia treatment. One is to see how frightened people can be of toys. I saw that before I treated someone for an Insight TV show, and that client was terrified of toy spiders. It's not rational. It's not rational. So you can't predict what the hierarchy levels will be. You have to go through that with the client, have the client rate the levels numerically. But you see what was happening there. You saw part of what I'm talking about, the exposure trials. they showed her with that scary music, they were most frightened. There are other times when she looked much better than that. But clients do get frightened at some point. Usually they flow right through it, although it takes a few hours. But a few hours of treatment for 30 years of phobia, that's not a bad exchange. And for the 2 TV shows, I did it all in one trial. Or, sorry, not one trial, one session, 3-hour session. That's pretty quick for curing a person. What you didn't see me is praising her for her courage. It was tough at times when there was a snake looking directly at her. She spent a lot of time with that. I just sat there next to her. So that's just one example. Now to go on to, and it worked well for her, and she's been doing well since then. It's been 6 or 7 months, so she's doing whatever she wants now with regard to life, regardless of snakes. Now the research findings, there are meta-analyses for treatment of different types of phobias. There are social phobias and there are specific phobias, such as she had with the snake, and people have height phobias and being in closed spaces and so on. The research evidence is very strong, have a large effect size, if you know that term. A typical treatment, if you compare treatment with this sort of gradual exposure versus waiting list control, it's an effect size of about 1, which is a huge difference. A little easier to understand is the cure rate, which is a nice term to think about in treatment. It's about 85 or 90%. That's very high, and the relapse rate is small compared to lots of disorders such as depression and substance abuse to have a substantial relapse rate. It's possible with phobia, but it's not so common. So the meta-analysis that have been done show that it's effective. It tends to be effective. It's not effective for everybody, but it tends to be highly effective. I've also had my own personal experiences in treating people. I treated myself, and my diving into water was using the hierarchy, and this was back when I was still a student. I did this pretty incompetently. I made some of the levels too big, really scared me, and I still remember being scared at some of those stages, but I wanted to get over it, and that's what clients are like. They'll face it. If they have confidence in you and they have some built-up momentum that they've handled earlier stage, then they'll face where it really gets scary for them, which is somewhat hard to predict. I never would have predicted that the toys would be so scary. Boy, were those frightening for the clients. So I treated myself for that, and I was very pleased later to become a scuba diver. Anybody ever scuba dive here? The giant stride entry into the ocean? Boy, that would have scared me way back when. And my greatest thrill is flipping off a boat, off the side of a boat backwards, the way a frogman does. I just thought that was so cool. Man, I'm the real thing here. And that came from several hours of exposure trials, gradual exposure. I didn't do it well, looking back on it, but the method is so powerful, this respondent conditioning extinction, gradual exposure, worked very well for me. So I've treated a number of clients with this. In fact, when I ran the clinical program here, we had a phobia elimination program, PEP, and we treated 20 clients who had some sort of phobia. All these students were treating their first client with this ever. Every one of them has never treated anybody before. We got 17 out of 20 cures that I suspect would be permanent too, and that's about 85% cure rate for a beginner, although they weren't closely supervised by me. And I thought that was pretty good because that's what the studies find. When you set up by the experts, the leading experts in the field, and they do a study, that's what they get, about 85 to 90% success, and then you hope it continues forever. Also, some of my students in behavior modification, they do behavior change projects. Some of them try to eliminate a phobia in themselves or in others, and I've never looked at the rate. We don't grade them on whether they succeed, but they follow the right methods. I make sure of that. And they have a good success rate. I know some of these people because I see them a year later, 2 years later, and I say, you were in behavior mod, what was your project? And what's the status now? Typical question. They'll say, oh, I did this, I did that, and I did a phobia. And it's still working. It's been 2-3 years later, and that person can still fly now, can go see family members in another continent because we did this treatment 2 or 3 years ago. So undergrads, they don't all succeed. Some of them do it incompetently, or they just don't get around to doing it. But the ones who are conscientious about it and do as they're instructed have a pretty good outcome, and that's because of the potency of it. It's the surprising potency. That's one thing that surprised me is overall potency. I've been particularly surprised by the imaginal, how effective that is, how powerful the mind is, just imagery exposure. And now Rachel will talk about VR and where that comes into it. Come on up.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Rachel Chesham, so I'm currently completing my Psych Honours thesis under John's supervision. So I just want to tell you a little bit about my project and how it's been going so far this year. So my thesis focuses on the efficacy of virtual reality exposure therapy for social anxiety. In exploring its efficacy, we actually conducted 2 different meta-analyses. And the research questions for these were, firstly, does virtual reality exposure therapy reduce social anxiety when compared to no treatment? And the other one, does using the standard treatments of in vivo or imaginal exposure reduce social anxiety more than virtual reality exposure therapy? So when looking for studies to include in the meta, I searched numerous databases, things like PubMed, ProQuest and EBSCO. I also sourced additional studies from reference lists and also was able to get in touch with some of the key authors that are also relevant in this field, and was actually able to get a study from them as well. Now, a key requirement for the studies to be included in the meta was that they needed to use random assignment or a matched design. And the VR condition had to be compared to either in vivo or imaginal exposure or a waitlist condition. So after implementing all of the search strategy and considering all the aspects of the inclusion and exclusion criteria, I came up with 9 studies to be included between the 2 metas. So of these 9 studies, 6 were included in the comparison between virtual reality and waitlist, and 7 were included in the comparison between virtual reality and the other standard treatments of in vivo or imaginal exposure. So people with social anxiety, they have an intense fear of social or performance situations, but there's substantial variation in, I suppose, the number and the types of situations that these people fear. So of the included studies in the meta, some considered social anxiety by focusing on one aspect of it, such as public speaking fears, whereas others took a broader approach to it and incorporated exposure tasks that actually involved them exposing people to a wide range of situations. So things like a job interview, talking to strangers, and in one aspect there was even one of them that was returning goods to and from a store. So these sorts of situations were really varied. Now, virtual reality was compared to in vivo or imaginal exposure in many of the studies. So when people are exposed to the imaginal conditions, the client was required to imagine or visualise the social situations that they feared. With the in vivo interventions, these did vary from study to study. Some used exposure group therapy, whereas others were required to have a one-on-one session with a therapist. So there was a bit of variety there, but overall the main aim was that they had to have an in vivo therapy that involved real-life exposure to a social stimulus. Many of the virtual reality and comparison conditions use gradual approach to this therapy as well. And exposure sessions were tailored according to a person's individual fear hierarchy, or in some situations, particular scenarios were chosen depending on the individual's needs. Now, nearly all of the studies included in the meta immersed their participants into this virtual world using one of the VR headsets. Now, these are typically called a head-mounted display. Certain variations of the name exist. Brought one of these along today just to show you. Obviously, there's lots of different makes and models of these things. This seems to be a pretty popular design at the moment. Super simple to use. You just need your mobile phone, download a specific app or a program onto the phone itself, phone clicks onto the front there. I've already done that. Turn it on, pop that over your head, look through the goggles, turn it on, off you go. So it is really, really simple. Very, very simple to use. Now, just to give you an example of a virtual reality scenario used in one of the studies that's included in my meta. So it's a study by Anderson et al. In 2013, and they focused on participants with social anxiety disorder that specifically had fears of public speaking. So the virtual environments that they used included a virtual conference room, there was a virtual classroom, and also a virtual auditorium. And each of these environments was filled with varying numbers of people and could be changed depending on the nature of the person's fear. What was interesting about this study as well is that they could also manipulate the reactions of the people in the virtual audience. So they could make them appear happy, bored, or even, hostile. The virtual audience could also ask the person questions, so they could say things to them like, I don't understand, speak up, it's not clear to me. So it was a very, very interactive environment. One thing that they did do there as well, they were customised, the virtual situations were customised according to the person's fear hierarchy, and they were exposed to each item until their fear decreased. For all of the studies included in the meta, pre and post data was collected and participants were required to complete various behavioural or self-report measures along the way. Now, depending on the study, the time from baseline to final comparison varied amongst these studies. Some went from 1 day, others 12 months. The amount of time participants spent in exposure sessions also varied from study to study, as did the total number of actual treatment sessions that people experienced. So that was also as little as 1 session treatment and then anywhere as high as 16 treatments. Now, as for the actual results of the 2 metas, so I found that virtual reality exposure therapy was significantly more effective than waitlist control. Hedges G was used as the measure of effect size, and this resulted in a value of 0.82G for the comparisons of means there, and there was a p-value of less than 0.001. So according to Cohen's criteria, a large effect size is anything greater than 0.8. This effect size was higher than that, so this result really does offer some strong support for the efficacy of virtual reality exposure therapy for social anxiety when compared to no treatment. As for the comparison between virtual reality and the standard treatments of in vivo or imaginal exposure, there was a Hedges G of 0.00 and a non-significant p-value of 0.987. Now, this result indicates that there was no significant effect or differences in the means. This was interesting and also may lend some support to what's called the Dodo-Berg conjecture, which states that when bona fide psychotherapy treatments are compared, they produce equivalent outcomes and the true differences between them is 0. But more relevant here, I suppose, is that the results indicated that the various forms of exposure seem to work about as well as each other. A main limitation of this study was really the number of included studies. There was only 9 amongst the 2 metas. But it is important to note here that in this field there really hasn't been much research and studies conducted on this particular topic. So I suppose with more studies and more power, there certainly could have been some different results there. But hopefully in the near future, more high quality trials will be conducted and can add to this research.
Thank you. All right, so we'll take questions. You might stay up. I'll get back here. Questions? I'll ask you a question. Who's treated someone for phobia? Yeah? Did it work? Got one person who says, yeah, it's worked. All right. Support. Empirical support. You just treat one person or a bunch of them? Few. Okay. One that comes to mind. Yeah? Anybody got treatment for phobia that you want to talk about? Yes? You want to talk? What was your treatment? Oh, sorry. I forgot we're recording. I'm out of practice here. You get it. Let me turn it on for you. There you go. Natasha?
I was actually part of your clinic when you were running the phobia clinic.
Oh, the PEP.
Yeah, I actually attended that. My husband did too. I have a spider phobia. He has a blood phobia. So we were actually both treated for that, and we were both pretty successful. I mean, I still don't like spiders. I try to avoid spiders, but I used to be I would get to the point of tears, feeling nauseous, and but now I just feel more angry when I see spiders, so I just tend to kill them really, really dead. So, but I could never get close enough to be able to do that. So that was really successful for me to be able to even approach one, to be able to kill it was success for me. So yeah, I still don't like huntsmen or anything like that, and I can't get close to them, but I don't feel that nausea anymore. So that was very successful. My husband had a blood phobia, so whenever he saw blood, he would literally feel faint. He'd feel quite ill as well, but he's gotten to the point where he couldn't look at blood on television or anything like that, but he can now. He still, again, he doesn't like it as well, but he can face it, he can look at it, he doesn't feel the need to turn away from it anymore. So yeah, I mean, being exposed, going through that process was very successful for both of us in many ways.
Well, that's good, and that's been a few years. Is that right?
Yeah.
So it's been maintained, and that's my feeling about phobia treatment. It tends to be maintained. One thing I might say about the blood and guts phobia, that is a special one compared to all the other ones. And it's especially dangerous because of the fainting risk. You faint, you can hit your head and get brain damage, or other bad things can happen then. So there's a special treatment that we use to prevent the person from fainting. Before we do any exposure trials, we train the person to tense muscle groups to pump that blood pressure up, because that's what happens with just certain people. It's probably genetic in part. Their blood pressure drops suddenly when they become fearful, at least fearful in that stimulus situation. And if you can train them to get up, keep that blood pressure up, then you can do the exposure trials safely and the person builds up more confidence. Is that what happened with the
That's what I remember when he would watch things on TV, then he would tense up to make sure that he didn't feel faint, and so he could actually face it on TV, for instance. And yeah, now he can, he can deal with blood if he sees it in real life without, he still doesn't like it, but he can deal with it, and that's the most we can ask for.
Yeah, that's valuable, because phobias can be dangerous, can be deadly. Particularly the sort of blood where you won't get injections and tests yourself. That can end up killing you. Put it off and put it off. Other questions or comments?
I wonder, in light of the studies you've looked at,
Take that.
in light of the studies you've looked at, what are the conditions or what are the circumstances in which you would think it would be preferable, not in terms of treatment efficacy, but in terms of other factors, to use virtual reality as a mode of treatment as distinct from, in vivo?
For other sorts of phobias?
Well, I know it doesn't directly come out of what you've looked at, okay, but given your familiarity with that literature, which would probably be about all of the literature there is right now, do you see an argument emerging for particular sets of circumstances where, given they're equally effective, you would actually be choosing the virtual reality as a treatment modality? That wouldn't be based on what you said on efficacy, but there may be other important factors. So could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, so practical factors. One of them as well is a cost factor. So somebody, for example, with a flying phobia, it's extremely costly to take them up and do an in vivo type trial using it for that sort of phobia. So virtual reality is a lot cheaper sort of exposure to use for those sorts of phobias, for example.
Yes, and there's some, the parallels, there's a parallel between virtual reality and exposure and imagery. Sometimes you just can't do the exposures in real life in vivo. For instance, for flying, if you're going to do an early trial of landing, well, in vivo, they've got to go up first, but that may be a much higher level for them. So you see, you can't set it in the order you want always for certain phobias. Same for blood and guts. But in imagery and in virtual reality, you can put them in wherever you want. I mean, you have complete control over that. Also in the public speaking, you don't have to get a bunch of people. I did this with a client, and I got my secretary to come in, and then I got a student, my secretary and a student. We were going up in numbers of people listening to my client speaking. But fortunately, after 2 or 3 of those, my clients say, I'm cured. You don't need to get any more people. I'm ready to go and take my required speech class. I don't know if you know this, but in the United States, there are tens of thousands of people that need one class to graduate from university. And it's public speaking, because it's often required. They just will not do it. That's phobia. That's blocking yourself. But she got over it after dropping the class repeatedly, and then she went and finished it and graduated. It would be easier, though, to do it with virtual reality, where I don't have to get people to come in. And she could even do trials on her own then, too, with the virtual reality. So there are practical situations where you might want to use either virtual reality or exposure and imagery, because you have complete control over it.
I've also read certain studies as well that suggest that in the initial phase, people are just too frightened to go to that initial in vivo exposure. So starting them off even with a virtual environment is, even in that sense, a more progressive way to go about it.
That was really helpful. Thanks.
Other questions or comments? You want to hear how I almost became a hero in my own mind in phobia treatment? You want to hear this, don't you? Leech, I had a client with leech phobia. Do you like leeches? They're just blood suckers, aren't they? And I don't care about looking at a photograph of them, but when they're on me sucking blood, I really get into a panic and anger. I want to kill them, run over them, knock them off. But I had a client with leech phobia. And I knew what I had to do. I had to get a leech and put it on me and let it suck blood out of me. And then I'd get the client to do it with another leech that was still hungry. So I knew the treatment that we would get to that level. And so the nice technicians in biology found me some leeches. They're in water. And we went through the exposure levels. And right near the highest was the client having a leech on her and sucking blood. But one of the things I read is it's not actually dangerous. They don't give you disease, unlike, say, ticks and other mosquitoes. Leeches are pretty good. They're clean little creatures. So I decided to do it. And I was going to put it on my foot, and I had my shoe off and my sock off. I'm ready to be a hero in my own mind. I put that leech on there, and we're waiting, and 10, 20 minutes, and the client says to me, John, that leech is dead. And it was dead. It never took a drop from me. I don't know if something poisonous about my feet. It could have been the foot, actually. So that was my chance to be a hero, but it amounted to nothing. And I never saw the client again. She was distant. And so I don't know if she was actually cured and went on, and she wanted to be able to go out on her property where there were a lot of leeches. And I don't know if she succeeded at that, or whether that was my one phobia failure case, because a doggone leech died. You can't count on animals. And